Hi, and welcome to another Alfred Hitchcock discussion with my good friend Jane, as always, from Lady Jane Books. How are you tonight, in my case? Uh, Jane?
I'm doing great, Chris. Thank you so much for inviting me again for a wonderful discussion. I'm really enjoying this Hitchcock series, and I'm having a lot of fun just going through each and every one and discussing the meanings behind all the films.
Mm,
So I'm so excited to talk about I Confess with you today.
indeed. A first time watch for you, I believe.
It is. It was a first time watch.
So we took a bit of a chance in this case, branching out from the more established oeuvre of Hitchcock classics to go for this 1953 film.
That's
It
right.
was filmed in Canada and Quebec, as it turned out, even though it kind of follows the story of a priest who hears a confession of a man who's been murdered called Valette. And the guy who comes to confess it is a man called Otto Keller, who works for him as kind of handyman gardener, all of that kind of stuff, fixes things for people. And he gets stuck in the middle of the investigation because you can't talk about what happens in the confessional box. Like that is one of the rules of being a priest. When you sign up to be a priest, it's like thou shall not discuss anything. I mean, we can go into more uh religious terms if you want, but that is seen as a link between you and God. That's pretty much it in the Catholic religion. I think is a bit a good way to do it. We'll discuss some of the things around the reception of the film based around the kind of Catholic rules and whether people understood them rightly or not. We'll talk about the characters, we'll talk about the plot, and we'll talk about whatever else comes up because, as usual, we kind of veer off into the themes and the things that happen around this film. Starting with, what do you think? Did you enjoy it?
I actually really did. Funny
Mm,
enough, I seem to really gravitate more towards Hitchcock's later works, and we've talked about several of his later works on this channel. Um, and so I haven't had a lot of exposure to his earlier works, but what I did watch, I didn't like as much.
yep.
But when I watched this one, I really enjoyed it. Um, I really just like this idea of following a priest in his internal conflict
Mhm.
and setting up something that's really action packed from the very first minutes where there's a murder and things kind of go from there. So I think for a film that was created in 1953, it was a very suspenseful and pretty action packed film. So I was pleasantly surprised and I really enjoyed the cast, the characters, and the plotline. What did you think, Chris?
Yeah, I enjoyed it as well. I watched it for the first time in the middle of last year, and it kind of for not being a film that I'd heard people talk about and start Hitchcock, I was like, this is actually quite good. I think one of its greatest strengths compared to some of the other Hitchcock movies is the fact that it is short and it doesn't outstay its welcome. Like a lot of the later Hitchcock films started to veer into the 2 hours plus, and this is a 2 hours plus film would have been an absolute disaster, I think, in many ways. In fact, if anything, they could have shaved another 10 minutes off it or so from it. But as it is, it kind of gives it nice bookends of kind of drama at the start, resolution in the end, and kind of how it plays along through the middle. I don't think it's a perfect movie by any stretches. I think there's sort of a lot of leaps taken in terms of the storytelling and how they get to certain places, and you go, okay, that's convenient or otherwise. But I think on the whole, it's a very very watchable movie, and I also think it's one that isn't as obviously Hitchcockian as other films that we've seen as well. So you could just kind of point it at somebody and say, here's a pretty interesting drama story. And given some of the themes, and they would maybe be none the wiser that it was a Hitchcock movie, except if they spotted him walking down the steps.
Absolutely. Um, and I agree. It isn't quintessentially Hitchcock, which I know we've kind of said that about a couple of his films that,
Hmm.
he's always experimenting and doing different things. So there are times you really cannot pin down like his style. But I definitely agree that that was the most true for this one for me as well. One thing I really liked is that it is really an art form in suspense. Like
Mm.
the whole the way it's set up, the way it's shot, the characterizations. He is a master of suspense, and I think that skill set really shine through within this film.
Yeah, I thought is how he worked the suspense in this was very interesting because the suspense doesn't come from who did it, because we
Right.
know who did it. We sort of see how it's kind of pointing the whole way along. But the suspense doesn't just come from that part, but also with what is the makeup of his relationship with Ruth in story. Is it an illicit relationship, or is there something more going on? I think that's the bit. Every time you're kind of put together, you're you move forward in your seat and you go, well, actually, what is happening between these two? Because it does seem to be presented, at least at the start, that the two of them are having an affair currently and at the time. But we always have that nagging suspicion in the back of our head that we're kind of introduced to Father Logan as being a very honest, forthright, kind of do the right thing person. So you think it's unlikely, and you sort of, but you're kind of interested in that whole makeup and mechanic.
I definitely agree, and I think also in Hitchcock's later films, he kind of relied a little bit on camera shots and angles and different kind of almost like tricks to build
Hmm.
suspense. And with this film, really none of that had been established yet from his style. And so I agree that his suspense built up from the characters' interactions and what was happening on screen versus this kind of internal monologue that he's kind of known for later on. So I think that was really interesting that even before he had really established his style and some of his hallmarks, he was able to create a really, really interesting storyline just using characters and their relationships.
Yeah, yeah. There's no doubt about how strong the character work, I think, is through this entire film. Although I think it was interesting because we, before we start peek behind the curtain kind of thing, we try and make sure we get our character names right, etc. And yet, I think other than Otto and Father Logan, I did have to look up everybody else's name pretty much
I had to
in
ask
the
you
cast.
aside from
Yeah.
I did have to ask you, right? I got Father Michael and then I forgot his last name. That was it for me. Um, but yeah, I definitely agree. There's a lot of emphasis on all the characters' relationships to each other and how they know each other and their motives rather than
Mhm.
like who they are themselves in a way and their own characterization. So I think that's a really interesting ploy again to build suspense.
Yeah, they're very much the archetype. It's the detective, the wife, the love interest, the
The
husband of the
priest.
love interest, yeah, the priest, etc. The other priests, you know, all they all sort of have a role. And without going too far into the film, I think one of the really interesting parts, and probably the most interesting character in it, and kind of talk about this, is that the hero of the film, I think, actually is the person with the most story to tell, which is the wife, Alma Heller, because she, from the very start, is conflicted. She's not as accepting of what Otto has done, and she obviously knows, you know, it would be a disaster for her if it was found out, all the rest of it. But she has an internal conflict, and while we don't get her story the whole way through, there are obviously fragments from before in life. You can assume that it's kind of our Catholic upbringing, our Catholic guilt has done it because that's where they're working, etc. But there definitely is a lot of that side that I think there was more underneath the surface with her, that could and should have been explored possibly, but she did enough in the end to kind of give us a happy ending. Yay!
Absolutely. Um, and that's another thing that I think is really well done by Hitchcock. Like, we only get really a snippet of her. She's kind of always
Mhm.
in the background, and she's there, and she has conflict, but you don't really suspect her to be the one to kind of save the day,
That's
which
right.
is really, really interesting. And I thought was a really great conclusion to all of this as well, that she got that moment to shine.
Yeah. So I think we'll probably start the big main theme. I think there's big up the emphasis and pointing towards religion as a theme, and especially about Catholicism. I think it's very based around the Catholic Church, etc. I've touched on the fact that the sacrament of confession is very much not just about you sitting in front of a priest and talking. It's the fact that the gods hear your sin, and at that point, it's a closed space. It is not to be interrupted. It is not to be discussed outside of it. In fact, that screen that goes between the veneer is meant to obscure the fact that the priest can see who you are, that you can even see that the priest there is just basically a conduit to God. And I think
Yeah.
some of the feedback from the time was that it didn't do very well in the cinema, but a lot of people felt that its reliance on Catholic mythology or Catholic religion kind of meant that people couldn't connect exactly why Father Logan was so hamstrung by what he could do, aside from being, it wasn't the right thing to do, but he literally was tied to that fact.
I agree, and I think that's a really interesting aspect to the story that, um, perhaps certain audiences couldn't understand, because I know that on my very first watch, I kind of pondered, well, what would happen if he just told the detectives? But that's not a reality for him because his beliefs and his livelihood is so strong. And I think that's something that perhaps individuals who are familiar with the religion could really understand analytically on why this is such a conflict for him. And I think that's interesting to wonder if audiences back then took it the same way or not.
Yeah, because it also ties into his decision to even go into the priesthood. For those who don't know, Catholic priests cannot take relationships. The relationship is with God, and God only. And the fact that he forsook a strong romantic relationship to step in and live a life of service and live a life with God meant that, if he had have told her, it would have made him not just a mockery, but it would have made a big problem of all of his life's decisions to that point. It would, the whole foundation of his life would have fallen apart, and actually the psychological trauma that would have caused would have probably been much worse than actually going to jail and all that would have come with it. So while he was sort of, I think it's one of those things, he was hoping that God would guide things to a good conclusion, or otherwise he uh he needed to have faith for that to happen.
I agree. And I think that if that wasn't established, he would have definitely had more of a crisis of identity, both
Mhm.
religiously as well as personally as well. Because and so the priests live like this is their day-to-day life, this is what they've devoted their entire being to, and so it's not easy to kind of shed that in that kind of a secular sense for your
Yeah,
own good or for your own pleasures or your own interest or anything like that. And I think that really shone through that really came through in the storyline as well, and really was a backing to Father Logan's character.
yeah, and especially when you consider the rest of the cast, the rest of the town, even the other priests. The other priests only really seemed concerned with a bike being brought into the house and the state and what's happening on the bike, whether it's got a flat tire or not. There isn't a sense, I think, from the rest of the town that the town is very deep rooted in faith in some ways, because it's very much outside of these couple of central characters and people that are adhering to it. Very much a very normal town. The detective does the detective work. It's not anything like that. There's only just a couple of characters that realize that actually prosecuting a priest is sort of troublesome in
Yeah.
some ways, but in their own way, the fact that it went so far showed their own ignorance, if you know what I mean. Like the detective character, his own ignorance of actually how much Father Logan was duty bound, even
Mm.
though he didn't say it. He could have understood it in much the same way as like a lawyer has an oath and a doctor has an oath. In much the ways, it's not that dissimilar.
Or even you could argue that a detective has an oath to find the truth.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
So, yeah. And I definitely agree that everything else kind of outside of it seemed very secular. Like they're repainting their living room. They're wondering what's for dinner. Like they're not really like concerned about, you know, the person who had just gotten murdered. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
there is kind of this divide where you're seeing Father Logan, I think, take it, I don't wanna say more seriously, but more seriously for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes him so interesting as a central character because he's looking at things so differently than every other character.
Yeah, his seems to be a much more considered late life choice than the other priests, for instance, or maybe he's a bit younger than one of the priests, etc. But that he has definitely come into this as a later stage vocation, probably as a result of aspects of the war, etc., that he was involved in and what he's seen there, and
Right.
how he's dealing with that trauma that don't happen for the other people within that setting and that circle. He's very serious about being a force for good within that entire town, whether they believe or they have faith or not. He's going to do and spread the word and do the right thing in that way, which is, I think, a really interesting aspect. And I'm sure it's one of the reasons that Montgomery Clift would have really been attracted to the role, because in its own way, it is quite meaty, compared to basically every other role that's within the film.
I agree. I totally agree. I think there's a lot of depth to it.
Yeah. Now, as it turns out, Montgomery Clift apparently drunk his whole way through the filming of it, but I was drunk for most of it. Had a glazed look in his eye a lot of the time.
My goodness, I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
so he was hitting the downside of his life at that stage, even before his
Uh,
accidents, etc. So he was struggling. But as I think we talked about this last time, like the last film we discussed had another very attractive leading man,
oh yes.
and we move on to Montgomery Clift, who I would sort of argue maybe even more attractive. Not that I'm the expert on it, but he's an incredibly good looking man.
Yes, he is a very, very good looking gentleman. That's one thing. Hitchcock, he can make a really nice looking cast.
Yeah.
Um, but I what I really liked about him is that he kind of has a little bit of that younger persona in him, and
Mm,
that kind of
yeah.
shows through with his features that, like you said, he's probably younger than the other priests. He does give much more of an innocent type of vibe. Versus some of the other leading men that we've discussed in many of these stories. And so I really kind of like that he automatically has this type of innocence, and that also connects with like his conflict of, do I do the right thing? Do I uphold my vows? Do I save myself? And I think that really goes hand in hand with his character. And I just think it was very, very smart casting in that way, because
Yeah.
Montgomery Clift really carried that off very well.
Yeah, it is sort of argued that Hitchcock wanted to carry Grant, James Stewart, etc. But I'd imagine that Montgomery Clift was hot property at the time and probably a bit cheaper than those other two as well. Which you'll never
But I
know.
could
But he,
I couldn't imagine, another type of leading man,
no,
because I
I agree.
sometimes, I think both of the actors that you mentioned have their own styles, and f I think for a main character, Montgomery Clift drew just enough attention to it, but not overly drawn attention to his role, which I think is a really, really interesting balance as well,
Yeah,
versus someone like Cary Grant, big shiny personality. Jimmy Stewart, wonderful actor, but has a certain persona about him with his Hitchcock characters. And I think that Montgomery Clift's unassuming nature really worked well for the role in this, because for a um, main star, we're obviously very, very invested, but we're not overly consumed by him. And I think
yes.
that was smart. I think that was really, really smart.
Yeah, those other actors couldn't have helped brought charisma to it, and
Right.
charisma is not what you needed from that character. What we got in Spades actually was that kind of sincerity and a seriousness that that kind of place in society and that kind of role would needed and demanded. He needed to be solemn when people, especially when people come to confess, etc. They weren't walking in and going, "What have you done now, Otto? You big clown." What have you killed somebody again? What? Can you
Yeah,
not keep yourself right? All that kind of stuff.
exactly.
So, but that again, almost like a mask that he wears all the time in terms of how he rationalizes it. Even when he's under threat himself, he very rarely he does on a couple of occasions lose his cool in some ways, but they're seen as big shocking moments uh, for effect at that stage. And I really like Montgomery Clift in this role. I think it's like you say, an extremely strong piece of casting, considering the character that they needed to play it, and probably the options that they had. Because again, physically, he's not a domineering person either. He
No.
didn't loom large over people. He definitely was one of the. He's kind of a height, and even what he wore, he sort of blended in somewhat. Aside from this kind of long flowing dress that he was kind of he was wearing about the place. That he looked very good in. Jeez, I wouldn't like to fit in one of those myself. It looked a bit snug.
But also, I think like his features added a level of like kindness and like trusting as well, which I think was really interesting. So I'm very glad that he was casted for this. I think he did a really great job.
Yeah. He also has one of those kind of ageless faces in a lot of ways, doesn't he?
Classic. Yeah.
He could be any age whatsoever, anything from about 17 to 40. He could have been
Right.
there, but and you could have picked him for whatever age that he was. He was, in fact, what age do you think he was when this was filmed?
30, maybe?
Yeah, 32. Probably around
Oh,
32, 33. Not bad. That's pretty good, but he died at 45, which is
I know. Way too soon.
way
Way too
too
soon.
soon. But a very, very talented guy. And one who is, I think, for Hitchcock to work with him, one who was famed for being a method actor, as is Carl Malden, actually, he was the detective. Him and Brando came from the same kind of tree and were good friends as they were. But Hitchcock is well known for being a control freak, as we know. We've talked about this many times
Yes.
over the past. And it was apparently well known that Clift's method, etc., for doing the scenes drove Hitchcock absolutely insane because he would have done what he felt that the character wanted to do at the time. You know, he got into the idea in the head, and Hitchcock basically just wanted somebody to do exactly what he said. So as he scripted it and he reacted, he wanted them to walk there, talk there, say the word in that intonation of that line. And apparently they blew take after take after take after take after take because Hitchcock wasn't happy with how Clift was acting the role. Plus the fact that he was drunk a lot of the time and all of that kind of stuff. I think it was a very tumultuous um filmmaking experience for those two. They seemed like a very unlikely pair to put together.
Well, to be fair, I mean, I think a lot of Hitchcock's sets were pretty tumultuous. There's
Yes,
a
that's
common
true.
factor there. So, um, but I don't know too much about Cliff's history a lot. It's something I would like to learn. I always like
Mm,
to learn about like old Hollywood and the different like uh, individuals who worked in the cinema at the time. So I will have to research a little bit more. But this film made me want to research a little bit
yeah.
more.
His life story and career, and actually the films that he does along the way, make for a really fascinating exploration. If you wanted to deep dive into a character, especially um after things events happened in his life and his kind of health started to suffer, and he still tried to act, and you watch those performances and you can see he's just not quite who he was, in a lot of ways, and is the way that it portrays is very different, and it's such a shame. So lost so young, and somebody that kind of lost himself to the fame in a lot of ways. So
Mhm.
yeah, definitely worth exploring for that. Interesting fact about this film: it was banned in Ireland.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
Why do you
Why?
think?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Ireland being one of the most Catholic
Oh, good. Now
countries
I
that there
understand.
is.
Now I see where you're going, Chris. Yeah. Yeah, I think perhaps, religious undertones to the film as well may have been a little
So
controversial at the
it
time.
was specifically the relationship between Ruth and Father Logan, even though it predates him going into priesthood,
Really?
they
I'm
thought, yeah,
surprised.
that they thought that would cause problems for clergy and people questioning why they couldn't take partners, etc. It would have raised questions at that point. So just banned for 5 years. So it wasn't shown until nearly 1960
That's interesting.
in Ireland. But I thought that was quite interesting because again it shows the attitudes to religious storytelling. I think at the time, not just in Ireland, but I think going through, and American audiences could identify with some of it because of religious aspects of it as well. It kind of shows that it was such a different place, and especially when you consider, like, I would say, if anything, religion has become diluted in modern society much more than
Mm,
what it would have been then. But that people are much more accepting that it's just obviously the way that it was, and then just accept it for what it was rather than kind of questioning it or taking it as a guiding stick for morality or something.
interesting. That actually makes a lot of sense. I know in film, um, historically filmmakers don't like to cross anything that has religious undertones
Mm.
many times for various reasons. I think that actually happened with the Hunchback of Notre Dame that Disney did. I think
Ah,
originally, if I recall correctly, originally the judge in Disney's rendition of Hunchback of Notre Dame was supposed to be a priest, and I believe it was
right.
maybe a Catholic priest. I'm not sure on that, on which denomination, but I do believe that he was supposed to be a religious figure. And I believe that Disney did not want to cross certain authorities within the Catholic Church, and that's why they made him a judge instead. So
Mm,
if you look at the story, it does kind of make there are undertones that he was meant to be a more religious authoritative figure, but because of certain other undertones in that story, they didn't want to ruffle
makes
any
sense.
feathers, and so they made him into a secular being as well. So I think that there's been a history of Hollywood and filmmakers kind of tiptoeing around certain ideas in filmmaking, kind of like what would happen in Ireland.
Well, there is no doubt that for most of the 20th century, the power of the Catholic Church was frightening for an awful lot of people. And in fact, I think it's only recently when you look at certain horror movies or certain films that you go, "Oh, I can't believe they're even getting away with that." Like the whether it's the Catholic guilt in me or whether it's some sort of way that was brought up, the things that you would expect to see that a priest do or people that happen in a religious film. Like I think of something like Paul Verhoeven's Benedetta, and if you ever
Mm,
see it, there's a scene with a an idol of Mary that's used for um for something, let's just say, but
oh,
that would never have been that would never have got through censorship or anything, 50 years
right.
previous. There's just no way that that would have been acceptable. Um,
Yeah. I do think that there's definitely been, like, a dilution of kind of the line that audiences
mm,
accept now, um, I and I think that's due to several factors. We've had a lot of, like, kind of controversies in the media with several, like, religiously, themed things, whether that be
yeah,
music videos, and I'm sure also the history of the Catholic Church kinda plays into that as well, that people
indeed.
are a little bit more attune to certain things as well, so I think that kind of reverence is gone now, but it makes sense on why it would have been in audiences back then.
Yeah. And I think you can point to various, like you say, music videos, etc., that kind of started to play. I think very loosely, but were criticized at the time. Like Madonna's "Like a Prayer." It was very
I agree, that
uh,
was very controversial back when it
back
was
then,
released.
and you watch it now, and it's like, why? There seems to be nothing to it. But it sort of leads into the idea that in modern society, certainly towards the end of the 20th century and the 21st century, Hollywood has been seen as its own religion in a lot of ways, and
Yeah,
fame and all of that kind of stuff has seemed to been the secular form of religion and entertainment for the modern generation.
yeah.
Maybe I'm the wrong gen to attest to that, but that definitely is the way that I think it's seen to go. So
I think there's also just a cultural shift where audiences and populations now are just more open to talking about different things, be it
yeah,
be shocking or
definitely.
scandalous or anything like that. And in some regards, you could actually even argue that things need to be shocking and scandalous now to get an audience. And so I think that it's really shifted now, but I'm really appreciated that it was so strong back when this was being
Yeah,
produced and released. So it's just a different era. We're looking at it in a completely different era.
yeah, indeed. So, like, say, there's no getting away from the fact that religion and honor and duty and all of those kind of things are kind of the central theme of the entire piece. The
I agree.
investigation. Now, if there is a ropey part of this film, I think the investigation is it.
Really?
The fact that he gets suspected so quickly, and even when he comes up with an alibi, it's sort of brushed aside 2 minutes later,
Yeah, it's not
etc.
good enough. Yeah,
Yeah, they don't look at anybody else. And the only thing that I'll say about it in that defense, like, I was kind of glad that he got found not guilty at the end because there really wasn't an awful lot of evidence telling him that he ever knew Villette at all or anything aside from that chance meeting. They kind of built up the blackmail angle a little bit to give it a bit more veracity. But even so, he was very clearly a priest, and she was very clearly married at that stage. And
yeah.
her husband was supporting her and stuff. So it felt like more that the investigation was in service of the plot rather than the investigation being an investigation, if that made sense.
Yeah, I definitely agree on that note. I think there was I'd have to flesh out my thoughts a little bit better on this one because I know there's something there that I think is really important, but I just don't know what it is yet to put my finger on to articulate it, quite frankly.
Yeah. Yeah, it's stuff like it definitely works well enough. Like it doesn't destroy the movie. It doesn't kind of take away from the movie and make a mockery of it. But I think everything's very circumstantial. You know, you were seen talking to another person, not even to the person that was murdered, just to another person. You were seen, you know, like even
You were
uh,
standing
uh,
outside when we were raiding this building, like, how dare
yeah,
you? Like,
yeah,
okay,
or
everyone
the
else was.
even the kids you're describing, the guy, what height was he? Oh, is about your height, you know. Oh, well, that must be the priest, you know. Like how that could even be brought into it. In some ways, was kind of a bit silly in some ways, but again, it was to get to a point and actually to be able to raise those questions and to be able to see that actually, regardless of what was come up may, Father Logan was going to take the fall and was going to go to jail for this crime if he was found guilty. He was never going to speak up. He was never going to do anything.
He's just gonna accept it as his
Yeah.
fate, which you could also argue was kind of his trust in God a little
Yeah,
bit, that God
indeed.
would either
This is
take
fair.
care of it one way or the other. I think it's also kind of interesting because there's this theme, as I've mentioned, there's kind of this innocence around Father Logan, and you kind of see that the accusations are a bit of a runaway train, a bit, and I think that we can obviously make a lot of connections with other aspects of the story in this, with history and religious beliefs and things like that, but I think that's kind of, I think that theme of kind of like getting your pitchforks ready and like looking for, almost looking for a problem to have a little bit, and that kind of like human nature, like mob
Mm,
mentality type of thing, where things can, like you said, get so out of control even though there's no evidence, there's like no supporting facts here, they really don't know anything, but in human psyche, when you're convinced of something, you're convinced of something.
yeah.
And if enough people, or the right or wrong people, get convinced of something, there is that possibility that it becomes a runaway train and out of control. So I do see that kind of reflected in some religious stories within the Catholic faith. So I think that that was actually kind of interesting. I think that was what I
Yeah.
wanted to articulate as well, that that kind of mirrors, you know, something that, a phenomenon that can happen within human nature.
Oh, that's so interesting. Because certainly Carl Malden's character, Inspector LaRue, seems to be gung ho and convicting the priest at all lengths. Even when all the people go, well, I don't know. He's like, well, you know, I still think that's our guy. And interestingly, he's the guy that then smells the rat, so to speak, and kind of uses the fact that Father Logan can't talk freely and kind of presents that actually he has told, and that drives Otto out into the open.
Exactly.
Yeah. Talking about our friend Otto. Otto, killer. So, a couple of interesting things about Otto. Obviously, you know, a religious man, or so he purports to be. His devolution of character and of psyche as the film goes on is very much tied, I would imagine, to the guilt that with which he's experiencing at that time. Because again, it wasn't necessarily that he set it to kill Valette; he just kind of caught up his hands in the pot
Mm,
and took action on that. And yet, he has what seems to be a fairly simple home life for himself.
yes.
They obviously didn't have very much, but even that sum of money I don't think would have made a massive amount of difference to them, and I think that's kind of maybe where some of the wife's conflict was coming from. But I think it is alluded that they have come from poverty, probably because of the war, to come and live across the way. And he is a man that's increasing in age, probably wants to provide for his family, and sees that his opportunity to do so is diminishing. And so, actually, I think the breakdown of his psyche and his character probably happened before the film even started. They actually
I
cause that.
I agree. I agree, and I think, you could argue that he doesn't have a bad place here, you know what I mean? Like, he's
Yeah.
working, you know, his wife has her own work, they have a roof over their heads, they have plenty to eat, like, and I think that they did say that he was a refugee from war, or that he was traveling because of conflict in his country. Um, so, and when you look at it from that lens, like, you know, he's in a very, very safe environment where he's literally in a church, like it's
Yep.
probably, for that time, the safest environment that you can, like a sanctuary. Um, but there, I agree with you that his decline happened before because it wasn't enough for him. And I
Mhm.
think that that's actually very interesting because we could also link that to one of probably several of the deadly sins, probably greed or something like that, or envy, even.
Mhm. Yep.
Um, and that's what kind of causes his downfall. And I think it's really interesting that the more he tries to get away from it, like the priest is going to take the fall, he can't say anything, the more kind of deranged he gets.
Yep.
And so I think that's really an interesting parallel to this idea of sin as well, that you out in the world you may not know, it's a Catholic belief that out in the world you may not know people's sin, but internally it eats you up, and God knows, ultimately God knows like what you did within the Catholic faith. So I think that was a really interesting play on his dealing with his sin.
Yeah, and again, belabor the Catholic thing too much, but as you quite rightly say there, the Catholic guilt comes from the fact that your relationship and the confession, even though he was confessing to the priest and that he was sort of seeking absolution from the priest while also giving himself an alibi, it's almost as if he was challenging the priest as the devil to kind of go against. But realistically, that confession is not with the priest; it is with God
God.
in the Catholic, so that's conduit to God, and that, as you quite rightly say, the fact that he got absolution from the priest or whatever wasn't ever going to be enough because he knew in his heart, because of his upbringing and his morality, that actually he would get eternal damnation. It didn't matter if he got away from with the crime on earth and somebody else got put down in his place. He actually was going to rot in hell for that in some way, and it started to drive him absolutely insane.
It was a confession without the penance, and in the
Mm,
Catholic faith the penance is as important as the
yeah,
confession.
indeed, indeed. Four Hail Marys, two Our Fathers. Uh,
It's been a while for me, Chris. I'm gonna be honest. My soul's a little dusty, so I'm not sure about that.
yeah, as many of us have not performed that right in a while.
Mm.
You don't want to sit down and go, Jesus, I don't know where to start. I started to write it down last
Quite
night, and
literally.
I
Quite
I
literally.
fell asleep as I was on page 47. Um,
How long you got? Sir,
yeah,
the confessional closes in 2 hours. Like, we gotta wrap this up.
yeah. When I think back at the start when you used to have to go do confession and you were made to do it kind of at every sacrament,
Mhm.
there was going and I sneaked an extra drink of Coke, you know.
Right.
And
Right.
the priest had to make it sound like it was very serious. So he was like, "Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, this is
After
not
this,
good."
I'll tell you a story about my first confession, and, I don't think it's for, like, everybody, but I'll tell you, Chris, I promise that.
Ah, dear. So yeah, again, his character really interesting because obviously he's carrying the guilt, and then you contrast it with the wife, who obviously is trying to be the dutiful wife, trying to be the supportive wife, trying to see what's going on. At the start, it's very much it's okay. Everybody's going to get away with it, and I'll be able to have an alibi because I'm going to say that I seen the priest, etc., and that's where it was at the time. But you can see it eats away at her, and her Catholic guilt starts to come across, especially when it becomes the persecution of a good man and a person that's been good to them as a family.
Yes. Yes. I agree. And I think it's harder for her because it wasn't her sin. I keep going
That's
back
right.
to the idea
Yeah.
that, he's dealing with his own sin, and that because it's not her own sin, she kind of has a separateness about it where
Hmm.
she can be like, Otto, like this isn't good. But, you know, and so I think that she's very apprehensive from the beginning because she's kind of thrown into this situation because of Otto's actions, and
Hmm.
she has clarity that yes, the priest has been very good to us. I think she's happy with the life that they have. She didn't commit the sin of greed or avarice or
Right.
anything like that. Otto did. It wasn't enough for Otto, but I think it was enough for Alma.
Yeah. Yeah. And yet she does the right thing, but it's only after an event and when he's completely lost it in some ways, and it's while she's a hero in some regards, it was too late to save Otto. You know what I mean? To her Dillian actually cost soul and life of her husband, the man that she loved, and her own life
Yeah.
as well. Which is a tragic ending.
Well, I think it's kind of an interesting dichotomy here because if you think about like their marriage, it's almost a mirror to Father Logan's relationship with God because Father Logan's loyalty is to God first and foremost,
Yeah,
okay, and to his
yeah,
spouse.
yeah.
Alma's first and foremost loyalty is to her husband. See what I mean? So they're
Yes,
almost
yes,
kind of
yes.
like bookends. So I think that by going against him, it would have been almost as if Father Logan had broken his vow, in as keeping the confession. So I think that's kind of interesting that she was kind of put in this place as well, where she kind of had no choice but to
Mhm.
support as far as she could until it got to a point where she can't do it anymore. So
That is such a great point. The fact that obviously the sacristy or the confessional box is sacrosanct, but so are the words spoken in a marital home and in a relationship, and both
right,
are sort of bound by God in a lot of ways because
exactly, because they're both
that's
sacred.
that is a, a very powerful point you made there, Shane. It sort of
Thank you.
reframes her as a even more conflicted person because again that torture that you can see scene after scene after scene for her is hard to watch for somebody.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
and that would reflect Father Logan's internal conflict as well. What do I do? Do I save myself, or do I do
yeah,
the right
yeah.
thing, or do I, abide by what I'm bound to? So it's kind of interesting.
It's very interesting. Very interesting. So, have you anything else? I'm sort of through my little list.
Not too much. I did see that there were kind of these undertones of xenophobia a little bit,
Oh
and about
yes.
because he is a refugee and he's from a different country and he's trying to make a life here. I don't particularly like that he was villainized in this
Mm,
way. I think we could have done another type of character arc, you know, someone else that to make the villain of the story. So that's one problem I did have with it. I think there was a little bit of an undertone of xenophobia in the story.
yeah, I mean, it doesn't even have to be xenophobic, but Hollywood has made a practice for many, many years of being either xenophobic, racist, anything. The villain is often an other of some
Yeah,
sort,
yeah,
and it's really unfortunate. And I think you could have characterized it by putting a couple of lines of plot to say that they had grown up in poverty and tried to escape their poverty, and they'd run it. I think there are ways you could have
yeah,
rationalized it that they were a product of their environment and their circumstances rather than just being those damn foreigners up to no good.
yeah, yeah. So
Trying to go
that's
ahead,
one thing
sorry.
I didn't like about the story.
Yeah.
That's one major problem I had with it.
Yeah, it's sort of like the antithesis of what people are supposed to go to America for. So it's trying to shortcut the
Yeah,
American dream in some ways that you can work hard and you get there at the end and everybody can make their fortune. And he was like, no, I'm gonna take.
yeah,
And that is very un-American viewpoint, if you know what I mean, classic American viewpoint anyway.
yeah,
Um, and it's a really interesting point there as well. There's no doubt that the fact that they were both foreign is is probably unnecessary in a lot of ways.
yeah. That's how I felt as well. That it didn't have to be. You could have any other type of characteristic, and it could have carried that point better, I think.
Yeah,
But I didn't like that undertone there. So aside from that, I thought it was a really great film.
yeah.
But that was one problematic point for me.
Suppose I should touch on the fact that Anne Baxter, who was the female um, lead, so to speak, the love interest, didn't actually have an awful lot to do. It's sort of a minor role. I did like the bit where they basically just slept outside one day because it was raining. I mean, okay, sure. But she wasn't originally cast for that role. He had wanted to cast somebody else. Uh,
Who do we
Anita
know?
Bjork, you call her. So
Hmm.
as Hitchcock would want to do, he'd seen her in another film and went, "Oh, she'd be perfect." but she brought her lover and with her, and they had a baby together, but they were not married. And Warner Brothers
Oh.
made them change the casting because they thought that would have been problematic. Again, a product of the time.
I got some things to say about that, but it feels
Yeah,
like the Hollywood's got a lot of conflicting
yeah,
beliefs there.
you're
So
right.
that's all I got to say about that.
The most corrupt place on the planet
Right.
or industry on the planet, and yet they have this high and mighty. Again, I think
Right.
there's parallels
That's the
with
line that
religion,
we're gonna
etc.
draw?
There, yeah, yeah,
Really?
indeed.
Yeah, so
So,
uh
so interesting. Like I say, I really enjoyed my rewatch of I Confess.
I really
Um,
enjoyed it too.
uh,
This is the first watch for me. I'm gonna be honest. I watched it twice. The first time it didn't hold my attention as
mhm,
much, but then when I sat down and I actually focused on it, it was really great storytelling.
yeah,
And one other point that I like, it's a technical point, is even though it's a black and white film, there was so much depth to the sets
yeah,
and to like the lighting on the character's face, which I think Montgomery Clift's face blends very well with or lends itself very well to
yeah.
that really kind of stark lighting, so you see all the angular features and it's very striking on screen. But I love the scenes in the church where you saw all the details. I just thought it was a really, really well lit and well designed set for something that's black and white, and we don't have a lot of other medium for it.
And to that point, I think some of the fact that a lot of it was shot outside as well on open air sets actually means that it didn't feel claustrophobic. It felt like a bit of an expansive town. It felt like it had size and grandeur. That it You've seen similar films of this ilk kind of feel like they were shot on a lot, and all the walls are closing in and everything's just happening in a very small area. But this one had a sort of a feel to it that was much grandiose, as was kind of pointing out. I did enjoy that quite a lot, and
Yeah,
like Montgomery Clift's face, exactly right.
yeah.
Is
There was a scene where, sorry,
I was
Chris.
going to say, I was just going to say, lends itself to the camera very well. He was not a bit camera shy kind of looking man at all.
There was the scene when they're in the confessional and his
Mm,
face is like half lit and there's a light on his eye. And I don't know if that was purposeful or not. I'm pretty sure it was, but it was just if you took a snapshot of it, it was a very beautiful lit set. So I just thought like details like that where we don't have any color, we don't have any like other types of texture or anything like that, but just using lighting and his physical features, it really made a beautiful, beautiful set design.
yeah, yeah, and I think it talks to the fact that those small details. I don't think Hitchcock got enough credit for at the time. You know, he was seen as almost like the popcorn movie director because you knew what you were getting out of a Hitchcock movie from a storytelling perspective, but there was much more craft for the kind of respect that he did or did not get. And it's actually attributed that this film was a big favorite of a lot of the classic French filmmakers. They actually particularly loved I Confess, even though it was sort of forgotten about by pretty much everybody else. So yeah, really interesting watch, and I'm glad you enjoyed.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you again for inviting me into this discussion. I really enjoyed this one.
Cool. So until next time, where could people find you?
So I am Lady Jane at Lady Jane Books. I'm available on YouTube, which I have not uploaded very much because I got some things going on, but I will at some point in the summer. And I'm also available on Instagram at Lady Jane Books.
Yeah, pretty active on Instagram. You're making up for it rightly there.
Thank you.
Um, and doing that, and hopefully Jane will join us again soon, and we'll discuss another Hitchcock movie. Apparently, it's still
Absolutely.
plenty more to go through. We're doing all right.
I'm in it to win it, Chris.
Yeah. So if anybody's seen I Confess, please let me know what you think down below. Let us know your thoughts, whether it's a favorite or didn't hit for you or otherwise, and give some suggestions of what you'd like to see come up next. We have a list, but we don't mind interjecting and kind of giving other things pride of place. Until next time, take care.
Bye.